Hello, this is James. Welcome back again to a new Lounge season. They brought the tier system back for this one, thankfully. First of all, I had to record this commentary in segments, so I won't be able to comment upon the gameplay, but it was pretty interesting in my opinion. With that out of the way, I was looking through my list of potential topics and realized, alongside a few other topics that I've also lost the window of opportunity to make timely remarks about, that I intended to make a video about the CTGP exploit from around this time last year that was publicized by Mookie, only for me to promptly forget about it once the rumors of another hacker list releasing akin to the one we got in 2021 died down. I have briefly made reference to the wider RT community's tangential relation to cheating culture previously in episode 5, and I'll present the same point again here as I did in that video later on. But watching that sentiment gradually dissipate ever since has further indicated to me that the memetic virus that was last year's cheater paranoia is also no longer a particularly relevant factor. Which is a shame, because the history of cheating in this game and the nature of said cheats used in themselves aren't enough to underpin an entire video, given my lack of technical knowledge. The psychological aspect I just mentioned is far more interesting to me with regards to a player base's perception of cheating and how cultures across communities arise with varying degrees of negative predisposition against cheaters. But already via the wording of that sentence, you can see how my mind has an inclination towards addressing multiple communities rather than MKW alone for the sake of comparing and contrasting them, so I'd like to welcome you to the third installment of MKW versus other games. Something noteworthy about my experience online is that in the gaming communities I've been a part of in my life, there has existed a pattern of entirely unintentional gravitation towards the games with some of the highest proportions of cheaters out of any communities I've ever observed. MKW is one of the games that has historically attracted one of the most disproportionate amounts of cheaters in any speedrunning-oriented game, which extended to WFC as well prior to CTGP's widespread integration, and although that does have nostalgic value which I'll always be endeared towards, I wasn't playing the game at that time and thereby have no first-hand experience of that era's culture, nor is WFC-era cheating culture even technically relevant to anything that's taken place in the community over the past decade, since we're playing on more cheat-resistant infrastructure now. I do know enough about just how prolific cheating was back then to be able to make a connection to our contemporary culture, though, because while online cheating might have tended to be very lighthearted even at its most competitively disruptive, the nature of time trial cheating was much more pernicious, enough to sow distrust and cynicism across the community even after the tools were developed to detect task runs. There are still players like RussoX for whom the legitimacy of any given run is still ambiguous. It was such a pervasive problem that I'd argue, invoking my theory of how ideas propagate across iterations of a game's player base that I laid out in episode 9, that it permanently mentally scarred the community. The knock-on effect of which was observed as recently as when the TT community overwhelmingly voted to implement the CTGP anti-task code even in its, at the time, overly aggressive state. When it comes to online, though, cheating methods of the CTGP era have been a remarkably different beast, with the method keyword being what I'd like to zero in on for now. The prevailing position on cheaters, that being one of vehement social ostracization and distaste, is much of the same, which will be worth keeping in mind for when I get to the dedicated cultural juxtaposition segment, though the methods have become both more elaborative and more subversive. MKW wasn't built with any underlying cheating safeguards, but CTGP's anti-cheat alongside some preemptive Weem5 patches in the netcode exploit department have rendered most would-be cheaters completely hapless in identifying where to even start. Ignorance is Bliss was a seemingly perfunctory effort by Bean and Chatters, and yet it's been enough to prevent just about everyone short of Paystar from bypassing it. Given that Star has seen the most success in cracking CTGP, I want to compare and contrast his methods of exploitation to ones I've seen utilized in other games. As I'm sure everyone knows, the 2021 exploit was his doing, with the cheat package, in this case the infamous God code that universally increases your odds of pulling the theoretically best items across all positions, being exploited via alterations to the blob.bin file within the CTGP folder that contains most of the pack data. This is a unique method as far as I've seen because it incorporates the anti-cheat bypassing methodology of code injection customarily reserved for after an anti-cheat protected game launches, so as to circumvent file integrity checks that occur on launch, meaning you only have to worry about the runtime anti-cheat, with the actual technical process of file-based cheat exploitation during the game's startup, similar to outright hacked clients like those for PC games. As far as console game modification in general goes, there isn't much that feels like injection, nor does it even meet that definition at all, since it's all just persistent patch-based like how Homebrew works. But as for CTGP, it seems as if the aforementioned approach is how exploits take shape. You'd naturally assume that because CTGP is a closed-source console mod, as opposed to the inherently transparent nature of PC games which facilitates modding and cheating, that it would be more difficult to bypass. But with an injection mentality, so to speak, the avenues begin to present themselves. Quite contrary to the programming experience that was evidently behind the blob.bin exploit, last year's send-elf fiasco felt like much more of an oversight, although it once again notably initiated at-game startup, this time being delivered over TCP on your own private network. I'll reiterate that this is all a layman's perspective, and I've probably gotten half of the technical information wrong already, but if I had to hazard a guess as to how this works, I'd imagine that the reason why the beta code activation was a required step is because it deactivates a security flag or something. I don't see how it would be so easy otherwise. I've seen people claim that Bean is just a terrible developer and CTGP isn't as secure as it seems, but I've tended to give him the benefit of the doubt in the past, and in fact I think we should be grateful that the pack has proven this resistant so far, because the decline of cheating over the course of a game's lifetime is a trend I've witnessed the stark opposite of elsewhere. I realized recently that the fact I felt so incredibly underwhelmed by the gaming landscape of the 2020s is that the comprehensive feeling of groundbreakingness, that novelty and innovation I felt as a teenager in the 2010s, at least when taking into account everything that was available to me then when compared to the practically non-existent prospects I had playing on a shitty laptop as a kid in the 2000s. The 2000s had seen modded clients for online games, including hacked clients, but the mid-2010s were when I was introduced to a new development, utility modules and quality-of-life mods, which had grown more common in PC gaming and would eventually blossom into full-on utility clients created to streamline the experiences for popular games like Geometry Dash. Funnily enough, hacked clients were ahead of the curve as far as user interfaces and generally frictionless experiences went. Quality of life modding was still appreciably obtuse until around the late 2010s, while blatantly cheating on my Minecraft alt account felt like having a seamless control panel at my fingertips in 2014. At the time, though, blatant modules felt like the farthest that Minecraft cheating would go. If you assumed this wouldn't be another commentary about Minecraft and GD, you were wrong, by the way, nor is this the last time I'll mention Minecraft in this video. And for the next few years, that would remain the case. 2013 to 2016 was the indisputable peak of Minecraft PvP, and it was only through a divine act of providence that the game was not entirely ruined during its prime by closet cheaters. But just because the game happened to crater in popularity over the course of 2017 and 2018 as a result of the popularity of other prevalent PC games like Fortnite didn't mean it ceased to exist entirely, because a new kind of client had been in development under the radar throughout the game's heyday that would spill over into the wider community and ensure the game could never see a second golden age. I recall hearing of the first so-called ghost clients in 2015, which were hacked clients designed to both bypass server anti-cheats as well as provide additional legitimacy by only giving the user a range of subtle advantages across the board, capable of being used without a GUI for the sake of recordings and even wiped from your computer on a moment's notice if you were asked to screen share your game to prove you weren't cheating, which was a common occurrence on servers back then. A few of them were shared around the factions community, a good number of which were infected with remote access trojans that exfiltrated the user's account information, helping to control the spread of ghost clients to the wider Minecraft community by limiting the positive word of mouth they'd receive. By 2017, though, ghost clients had evolved in a few pivotal ways. First, they began to actually successfully bypass the anti-cheats of most servers, whereas the comparatively primitive methods used in previous iterations would frequently get their users flagged and banned eventually. Secondly, Ghost client developers and their business associates, since these were made and sold for money, realized just how much they were shooting themselves in the foot by keeping in line with unscrupulous social media promoters who would either insert their own Trojans into the code or otherwise scare potential customers away through general unprofessionalism. From here on out, the prevalence of Ghost clients would skyrocket, and all the while the old guard of servers with refined anti-cheats were shutting down as player counts continued to plummet. What occurred in the wake of this series of events is the takeaway I've been building to. By the late 2010s, ghost clienting had become a systemic and inescapable movement in the now atomized and neglected PvP community. But far more impactful than the advancement of the software itself was the cultural shift that accompanied it. Even in a competitive community where rampant cheating is commonplace, like late-stage WFC where players used item wheels left and right, even more crucial than the impermanent underlying anti-cheat infrastructure is the player base's attitude towards cheating. And in Minecraft PvP, cheating is cool. There's been an extremely perplexing trend I've seen that takes place in communities that never sufficiently immunize themselves against cheating culture. From the earliest phases of Ghost clients' existence through to their almost universalization, a process that once saw players who others weren't aware were Ghost clienting gaining status for their supposed skill, became so transmogrified by everyone cheating that the successful usage of cheats actually in itself became a signifier of status and coolness. Make no mistake, it's very possible for a community to recover from a cheating epidemic, even if it's been plagued for years. But once the rot seeps into the culture, you've passed the point of no return. And despite the resurgence of Minecraft's popularity at the onset of the 2020s, the corresponding comeback you'd expect for non-casual PvP game modes never materialized. Prospective players just couldn't stomach such a backwards culture and left as soon as they came because of how often they lose to cheaters. And just like that, competitive Minecraft lost its only opportunity at revitalization. Contrasting MC's culture with MKW's culture is such a stark difference that it gives me a sort of mental whiplash. The acceptance and even lionization of cheaters is such a profoundly foreign concept in this game that it makes me realize how grateful I am that MKW has such a superior culture. It's easy to identify markers in the decline of a culture, but more difficult in my opinion to determine what aspects of a community predispose it to its healthier approach. There are plenty of factors that I believe prevent the notion of cheating from gaining a foothold in MKW, but two entrenched ones I noticed that seem to work in tandem are the WFC community's pre-existing negative experiences with cheating alongside the MKW community's tendency to retain its culture over many generations. I detailed my theory of how internet cultures retain their values and belief structures as generations pass in episode 9, which is definitely my greatest work thus far, so I'd certainly advise giving it a watch if you haven't already. So I won't revisit it in very much detail in this video, but I very much believe it applies here. I imagine that there exists some sort of ancestral memories, that is to say a subconscious shared community experience, of the cultural degradation incurred by WFC cheaters that serves to promulgate players to reorient themselves in the opposite direction. Now take that underlying fear of being victimized by cheaters in the present and metaphorically overlay onto it a suitable anti-cheat solution in the form of CTGP. Close off those openings for cheaters, prevent them from ever gaining a foothold, because if they do, it's possible that they can undo all of those collective historical efforts to preserve the most auspicious community mentality. A community with a deep respect for its own history would be much more resilient to that kind of subversion, of course, but it can still happen. With MKW, though, there's a unique characteristic to this community that I think is the ultimate ideological defense against this. To return to an episode 9 adjacent topic, MKW players are highly superstitious, because they play a game in which luck is an omnipresent and critical factor. Seeing as God coding is the only feasible way to cheat without being instantaneously caught, since it's not like you can use a manual boom instant mini turbo codes and expect the guy next to you not to notice, the notoriety you'd gain as a luck-reliant player would counteract all of the status you'd garner from whatever high rank you happen to attain. In fact, something just like this has already happened before, but as a false positive. In early January of 2020, War Crash made a thread on the ill-fated MK boards, formally accusing Frozen of cheating via an analysis of his item luck in a war in which he got unusually lucky. Given Frozen's history as one of the very same cheaters that abused pre-CTGP infrastructure, the assumption was that he had merely returned to his old ways. And with a known coincidental relation of sorts to Paystar, it seemed like an open and shut case. Especially seeing as Frozen was nowhere to the large YouTube presence he would later come to be, and was coasting off of a considerably negative reputation at the time. And although Frozen wasn't cheating, the situation established something. That high-level MKW players refuse to let themselves grow complacent, lest they lower their guard too far and let a cheater puncture their carefully cultivated community bubble. I was notably critical while bearing witness to last year's GSC conditionals paranoia, but it can be reevaluated as ultimately healthy when viewed through this lens of vigilant, proactive defense. With this talk of other communities, though, I need to be careful to reiterate the importance of a community's culture in itself. There may seem like an implication that the extent of cheat detection in a game has an inverse correlation to how tolerant a community is of cheating, simply because cheaters cannot crop up as often if a robust detection framework exists. But culture is a delicate, ever-changing, essentially intangible thing, and it can require a bigger picture view to get a grasp of. With that in mind, I'll talk about another community that has managed to backslide culturally despite an apparent absence of the kind of structural, predictive factors that would logically engender a regressive culture, so as to argue for always keeping in mind the vital importance of cultural fitness, even when the cultural trappings of a community don't seem to open the door to any adverse belief structures. In episodes 9 and 11 of this series, I thought about the extent to which the conditions that underlie a game can predict its community's resultant attitudes towards things. Geometry Dash in the mid-2010s as a patently insecure product both on the front and back end is one situation where the theory that underscores the development circumstances milieu I discussed predicts a perfectly accurate model of a community. I'm sure it sounds like I'm gearing up to repeat myself, but I do think it's worth it for the sake of drawing some more comparisons. Back then, non-legit play was so common that there arose entire subcultures dedicated to either using cheats to upload extremely difficult levels illegitimately, or attempting to complete these so-called hacked levels without the use of cheats. The irony of which was that deceiving people into believing you had beaten these hacked levels legitimately via cheating was also a routine occurrence. The culture that was brought about as a result of GD's inherent vulnerability as a piece of software was one in which dozens of people attempted to lie and cheat their way to the top over the course of the next few years, with varying levels of success. Exposals then became commonplace as an attitude of skepticism gradually displaced the unsuspecting naivete that was there previously. But the intermittent periods of communal chaos that would crop up whenever a well-known player was exposed seemed to become a thing of the past when moderators in the competitive space began to systematize much more meticulous cheat detection across the board. They did this initially in the late 2010s, and in the coming years around the turn of the decade, the game would see a second renaissance, prompting another reevaluation of their cheat detection in 2021. And at the very onset of this project, the first player to be exhaustively checked under the improved standards was also the number one on the leaderboards. If you're into watching speedrunning content on YouTube, you may have seen this story before on Carl Jobst and Abasoft's channels. Space UK, the number one ranked Geometry Dash player worldwide, had cheated every single one of his achievements for years using a method that bypassed the community's cheat detection system. The fact he managed to get away with it for so long is admittedly fascinating, but of more interest to me and more pertinent to this video has been the long-term reaction to his exposal. You see, the GD community's relation to its history is most comparable to MKW in that there's so much community lore and oft-overlooked history that top players take pride in having a deep comprehension of. And just like with MKW, GD is a community that spent so many of its culturally formative years plagued by unapologetic cheaters. But I observe a crucial difference. That internalized fear of and contempt for cheaters that has been culturally propagated across generations by the mechanisms I discussed in episode 9 and just now is something I've never observed amongst GD players. My theory as to why this is that while GD players do also tend to remain in the community for many years, like MKW players do as many other tight-knit community-centric games, the game's player base is in greater flux overall and also tends to attract a much younger audience. Someone who's 13, for instance, initially becoming accustomed into the GD community will likely be eager to learn what took place in the game back when they were in elementary school, but the attitudes held by their predecessor generations would be lost on them because that veneer of culture isn't as tangible and evident amongst a large player base that's spread thin across such a wide range of ages and corresponding levels of correct cultural alignment with community values. Here's why I return to Space UK then. In the years since his exposal, he's become a sort of community anti-hero in his own right. Not merely treated as the butt of a joke for future generations like in communities with a healthy relation to cheating, but with the respect and adoration endemic to a large and unironic fan base, with many people calling for the rescindment of his lifelong ban. His interview was even one of the most popular on a GD channel that's interviewed community legends with hundreds of thousands of subs. All of a sudden, it feels like I'm taking glimpses back into the doomed Minecraft PvP community that I left behind. What a terrible, actively degenerating culture that no self-respecting person would want to be a part of. But yet, because of the umbrella of infrastructurally ensured legitimacy that competitive GD now exists under, it's been an entirely isolated incident. Despite the deep-seated sinful inclinations towards cheaters' cults of personality that seemed as if they'd threatened to boil over at one point, it looks as if the notion of any further career cheaters gaining ground is near impossible. Regardless, I should be careful to point out that this absolutely does not mean that the GD community is in a remotely enviable state. A huge swath of the player base has shown their true colors with their continued bizarre adoration of all the damage caused by former cheaters, and the cultural fitness that preempted the competitive community's progress towards stringent standards of legitimacy in the first place seems to have deeply eroded as a result of irony culture. If there were to be a cheating method that reliably circumvented the present detection setup, it would be a practically existential threat to the community because of how few cultural deterrents there are for this kind of behavior. Mere prevention is not enough to guard against the wrong kind of attitudes from subversively setting in the long term. Irrespective of GD's relation to demonstrable cheating, it's a game with a prominent modding scene that is going to remain popular for some time, and the community has had to contend with that fact. Even if a hypothetical game were to have an infallible cheat detection framework but a prolific modding scene, disputes would still arise over which mods were too much of a deviation from the vanilla experience. I primed the topic of utility clients earlier when I first discussed colloquially mod-friendly games. There's no community in which that is a more prominent concept than in GD. The use and alleged overuse of utility clients in GD has been a recurring theme in the community as its usage has approached ubiquitousness, and as their effectiveness has grown, they've concurrently become more controversial. Utility clients maintain a unique status in GD in that the usage of them is embraced by the community despite their adjacency to cheating. The by far most popular utility client is literally called MegaHack and has many of the same modules that have facilitated the few cheaters that have slipped through the cracks in the past few years. Yet there's a prevailing attitude that the client's capability itself is not to blame, and that the overwhelming majority of players who use the client to merely enhance their experience beyond what the vanilla game can offer with quality of life modules shouldn't be unfairly associated with categorical cheaters. MegaHack is presented entirely candidly without any pretensions as to what it should or should not be used for. It can improve the experience of a legit player just as easily as it can underpin a cheater's fabricated career. Whether it's employed constructively or destructively is entirely in the hands of the user. Regardless, I imagine some outside observers would be concerned with the very existence and predominance of such a thing in the first place, but once again, when it comes to games with such an innate focus on community contribution and modding, these sorts of developments are inevitable, even if it's just because there's money to be made. For what it's worth, MegaHack's developer only charges a few dollars for the client, which is so well developed that it's managed to single-handedly prevent GD from retrogressing into the kind of unregulated hacks-for-pay ecosystems of other communities that produced all those Trojan-laden Minecraft clients from so long ago. That isn't to say that the usage of utility clients and mods in GD is entirely without controversy. A problem with the usage of the client amongst top players that has often been commented upon is that they will simply enable each and every competitively permitted module in the client that offers them even the slimmest of marginal advantages, the majority of which are simply aesthetic. I'm personally enamored by this, since seeing the progression towards marginality in a different community is a huge boon to the verisimilitude of my theory of marginal advantage from episode 7. The apparent over-reliance of the player base upon utility modules was treated essentially as a meme, with the exception of a few controversial ones, but the impetus for a communal reassessment was the release of a mod called Click Between Frames. As would be implied by the name, it allows for players to break free of the game's frame rate-based input polling and play with the most accurate inputs possible, with the ensuing controversy arising from the fact that it allows for certain hyper-specific inputs that aren't possible in the vanilla game. For the first time, I began to see GD players authentically throw around the concept of disproportionate advantages. But here's the interesting part. Unlike MegaHack, Click Between Frames is free, and it can be installed on any Windows PC. How could a mod that can be installed almost universally for no cost possibly create an unfair imbalance? Well, I did say I wasn't done talking about Minecraft yet. Back in 2015, the go-to PvP server was a server called Badlion, and one of the reasons for the hegemony it maintained was how effective its anti-cheat was at both detecting and deterring cheaters. Perhaps the highest profile event on the server was a recurring ban wave that would occur once every few months called Judgment Day. The process of only banning in waves so as to prevent client developers from being able to ascertain what gets their modules flagged by an anti-cheat is nothing new in gaming, but what made Judgment Day so genius was how it preemptively averted the aforementioned social process of cheaters amassing community admiration. Badlion promoted itself as the server where ghost clienters who had previously escaped detection would be forced out of hiding, and that's the approach that helped them utilize their state-of-the-art anti-cheat to elevate both PvP itself and its culture, all while creating an exciting spectacle for the players. Apart from peripherally wrapping up that line of thought from earlier, it's also the kicking off point for this final topic as it relates to MKW. You see, in order to ensure that cheat developers would gain as little information as possible about what modules resulted in their ghost client's detection by the anti-cheat, each ban message for players banned on Judgment Day followed the same uniform pattern: banned by anti-cheat for unfair advantage. Unfair advantage. It's an easy catch-all, isn't it? I doubt that very much thought was put into it. Many of Badlion's moderators also felt the same, including Hivlik, a commentary YouTuber who I'll continue to reference forever, who centered an episode around all of the emergent shortcomings of a rule set that arise when an indeterminate standard like an unfair advantage is used as the metric for punishment worthiness. As he points out, the definition of an unfair advantage is open-ended in such a way that invites an interpretation from the moderators as to what that actually entails. The wording is intriguing in that it implies some kind of inexorable disparity between players that exists under the umbrella of fair advantages, like having lower ping than your opponent. We've already established that the existence of a software is perhaps the theoretically worst possible metric, since if a hacked client were free and open source, then it would be a trivial matter for everyone to install it, and yet this is clearly an unfair advantage while the natural disparities between player setups are accepted as being part of the game. I think this kind of discussion naturally lends itself to a sort of intellectual pussyfooting, so I'll prevent myself from equivocating here and state this theory outright. What should be defined as sanctionable in a competitive game's rule set, or should be called an unfair advantage if you like that wording more, is anything that falls outside the realm of what a player would, in good faith, assume their opponent is adhering to. To illustrate the difference at play, I'll provide an example. Brody plays using an adapter that allows his CCP to plug directly into his Wii, thereby gaining the lower latency advantage of GCN users as opposed to the Bluetooth delay that classic controller users typically deal with. The reason I specify a good faith interpretation is to ensure that there is both wiggle room built into the philosophy as well as a central focus on the community's present belief structure at a given time. For instance, you could claim that what Brody is doing is comparable to Battlefield console players who have recently been getting their consoles banned for using a hardware device called Cronus that converts keyboard and mouse inputs to controller inputs so as to be able to use aim assist. However, this is both a bad faith interpretation and a false dichotomy as well. Just like the GD players who purchase faster monitors and processors, Brody is also following the principle of marginal advantage via superior hardware. Nothing about this should make anyone upset. Or how about an overlooked advantage endemic to the Wii itself? Jack Can and Winter have hardware modded Wiis that natively output HDMI, without the usage of a Wii to HDMI, which introduces lag and has lower quality. But who can blame them for wanting the highest visual fidelity? There's not much more to say on that front. As far as MKW is concerned, I think the more compelling avenue as far as unfair advantages go is once again the software side. Remember how I just said that aligning a rule set with the capability that a game's software has to incur an advantage is the worst metric imaginable? That isn't actually something I've ever seen implemented intentionally. The inclination for players to want to subtly subvert a given rule set takes place when the cultural values that induce that rule set aren't overt and pervasive enough on a cultural level. If the players doing so are rebuked for trying to push the envelope, then the rule set will likely be preserved. If they are not quickly punished, however, then the frowned upon behavior will gain traction. And even if steps are taken to proactively prevent it later, the players who got used to playing with the disallowed advantage will be culturally opposed to the official state of the game going forwards. In games with imposed rule sets like Fortnite, the developers noticed that people were playing in stretched res to increase their FOV too far in 2019 and patched it out just like that. That era of the game was made into nothing more than a comforting memory entirely overnight. But in games with community-defined rule sets where developer interference isn't a concern, it's common for cultural encroachment to occur gradually as the process of generational transition erodes the values that once existed. The same GD players complaining about click between frames daily drive a suite of mods that would have been unthinkable to the pro-vanilla 2010s player base, but few seem to notice the irony. Alternatively, the MKW community, which has historically been given both the host of mods that are built into CTGP as well as the remarkably customizable MyStuff apparatus, seems to want to consciously recalibrate itself away from the features of CTGP that are not essential to gameplay. In cultural terms, the RT community's rejection of MKPS was an indication, a few years ahead of the curve, of the CT community's later rejection of modded settings like meatheads on minimap and draggable blue shells. However, late last year, the GSC staff decided to take a surprising step back and loosen up the rules on allowed MyStuff mods. There was an update to CTGP that added a new MyStuff-related host restrictions setting that prevented people with common.szs and revocart alterations from joining the room. Seeing as a common.szs mod was what allowed leops to use his invisible blooper texture, and what allowed Barney to use his custom audio whoring setup that let him hear blues from far away, staff assumed that the changes that were still achievable without those two files were insignificant enough to allow, and no replaced tracks became the required setting. Now, cut to 6 months later, following the Season 11 Grand Finals of D1, with the result being 2-1 in AI's favor against JX. A week after the match, someone sent Frozen the unlisted YouTube VOD of Krusty's POV, and JX saw something in it that made them very upset. Krusty was using a BR-TCR edit that removed the black screen fade out while respawning. He wasn't bypassing anything and hadn't hacked the game at all. The host settings simply didn't prevent its usage on a technical level. But given that this could have theoretically given an advantage, an unfair advantage if you will, considering that a good faith assumption on the part of JX pertaining to what my stuff edits were being used wouldn't have included that, Frozen successfully managed to get the match result overturned, even though Krusty hadn't gained any tangible advantage. The fact that the GSC staff took JX's complaints seriously, even though they rightfully identified that JX were objectively making a mountain out of a molehill, speaks to how much more credence is given by MKW players to remaining a cheat-free competitive environment than in other games. I chronicled the history of multiple cultures in this video with the aim of presenting all of the pitfalls that the MKW community has avoided, either by virtue of the technical contours of the game itself, or the continued efforts by community members to ensure that people get to keep playing a game that isn't ruined by cheaters. And it's with this in mind that you come to sympathize with Frozen and Jeff's militant approach to the situation. With players like them who've been around for so long that they put veterans of other games to shame, they've become a manifestation of all of the ingrained values from the generations they've lived through and outlasted. And at the end of the day, there is absolutely no room in that milieu to permit anything even remotely cheating adjacent that could reintroduce the culture that players of old hoped to shut out so long ago. Krusty's ban ended up getting reversed alongside the decision to allow my stuff edits, but I haven't seen very many people complaining. I think I wrapped things up quite nicely with that, so thank you for watching.